some of the basic themes of Dracula emerging early on in the book. Issues of race and class consciousness emerging by way of Dracula's aristocratic arrogance. You remember that passage in chapter 3 in which Dracula holds forth, carries on for some time, a couple of paragraphs, before the somewhat stricken Harker. He says, "We Zakelles have a right to be proud, for in our veins flow the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Here in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden gave them, which their berserkers displayed to such fell intent on the seaboards of Europe, aye, and of Asia and Africa too, till the peoples thought that there were werewolves themselves that had come. Here too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held that in their veins ran the blood of those old witches, who expelled from Scythia had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools, what devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins?" He held up his arms. So we have Dracula claiming kin with Attila the Hun, right? And not being at all upset about some of the stories about his ancestors being taken for wolves, werewolves, berserkers, etc. There's a lot of arrogance on display, I think you would agree, and a lot of it is race-based, right? This business about the European races, the whirlpool of European races, and how his own particular race, quote unquote, has been dominant. And he, in a sense, what emerges as the book continues is his attempt to restore his race belatedly and in this weird new undead incarnation to its proper place atop the races of Europe, okay, and ride the whirlpool, so to speak. So that's a big part of the book, and I think it's very easy to miss it as you get into the Gothic, or allow yourself to be charmed, okay, horrified, happily and delightedly by the Gothic apparatus of the book, that it has this issue that would have been very recognizable to Victorians, having something to do with the question of race, and I think class as well. There's a lot of talk about the peasants, okay? He almost sees the middle class Harker as kind of a peasant in a way. Now, he treats him with great respect, you will recall, at least outward. Great politeness might be the right way to put it, but you do get the feeling that at some level, there's the way that he looks at the world. You have the masters and you have the servants or slaves, and I think he would put Harker in the latter class, okay, because he simply doesn't accept the post-feudal organization of modern Europe. You know, he's still got the old feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L, the old feudal system, right, which is his system. So there's number one. Number two, quite arguably, this is going to be familiar to some of you, this issue, Lucy's feminine sexual vanity, right, which she, of course, disavows. She says to Mina in her letter in chapter 5 that she and Mina can eschew, they can despise even, she puts it, vanity. She's talking about vanity around men, the vanity you have when you know that you're attractive to members of the opposite sex who are attracted to you, right? Well, there is a long tradition of folks who've found the book to be very interested in this issue, right? Especially when you put Lucy's behavior amongst the men next to the trio of women, daughters, sisters, more daughters of Dracula, right? In the earlier chapters, right, you will recall that they are the figures of ribald coquetry, right? That we, you know, those earlier chapters, what we see is their attempt to lure sexually Harker, and Harker's unwilling and unwitting, but irrepressible, okay? It's not something he can control, right? His attraction to them, his response to their advances, okay? So this sort of predatory female sexuality, I think it's a little bit rough to say that about Lucy, right? But there are some who have said it, that she seems to, despite all of her disavowals, seems to enjoy very much having 3 marriage proposals on the same day, right? I think she can be defended, and I know that some of you think she can be too, right? But do we not see, you can see how this might be argued by someone, that Lucy's really not that different. Mina's the one who's different, right? She's the final girl. Lucy is not that different from the three sisters who are sexual predators and in fact actual like animal predators, right? And we see what happens in Lucy's case when she is seduced, as it were, by Dracula. She herself becomes a kind of minor predator roaming around at night and finding little children to predate upon. So that's a big issue, and the sexual dimension of the whole thing. You know, when the blue fur woman is out wandering around at night, which is not something that polite women are supposed to be doing, right? It's more like something you would see would be almost a figure of a 19th century prostitute, right? Would be brought to mind by that conduct, right? I think for most Victorian minds. You can see this really is an issue in the book. Okay, so here's a third issue in the book that emerges again early on in the pages of the book, the pages that you have read. An element of Darwinian horror emerging by way of Renfield. Now, we're going to be talking about this very shortly, so I'm just going to leave this one out for now. It's going to be pulled out and discussed in the rest of this brief video. Number 4, by way of Mina, the issue of communication and the new technologies thereof, right? The stenographic method is a method of defeating the horrible. I mean, we'll see. This doesn't go away as an issue in the book. It remains an issue. There's a lot of attention in the book to, I mean, just look at the form of the book itself. All these letters. You can have newspaper reports, as you know, down the road. You've got, you've got actual, very primitive form of a recording device that's going to figure, and you have all kinds of devices that are not exactly technological, but almost seem to be sort of like that, and they seem to be very new. I don't want to give away any part of the plot, but you're going to find that Mina is really at the center in so many ways of the communications that go on in the book that are really important and end up becoming a big part of the plot, even, as you will see towards the end of the book. Now that you're actually reading Dracula in all of its detail and its kind of complexity, of course, which is mostly just left out of the film versions of the book, at least the ones that I have seen, right? And there's some distrust of the old technologies. Do we need a new technology to deal with this new sort of monster, which is bizarrely new and ancient at the same time, right? Which is insisted upon so often in the book. So there's number 4, this whole question of communication and technologies of communication. Number 5, and I think that points to the larger question of technology even, right? By way of communication technologies being an example thereof. Number 5, communities of men, almost committees of men. Now, we've seen this one before, right, from last week, right? And you will recall the Showalter essay that is devoted to this issue, that, you have this group of men that seem to be the subject of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, strange case, as I tend to call it. And I think we have the same thing in this book emerging. The entente between Lucy and Mina breaks down. We don't see much of the trio of young women, young/old women, from the beginning. We see that they do make another appearance, as you will see. But it's, Lucy is gone early on. So the friendship between Lucy and Mina, it's mostly Mina. It's just Mina and the men. And, doesn't she almost end up becoming like one of the boys, right? We'll see. But you have this, there's some suggestion that it takes a committee to kill a monster in this book, as we're going to see. It takes a community and a committee, and it has to be a committee of men. I mean, again, that becomes a really interesting issue as time goes on, because Mina does contribute in a very significant way to their successful, and I think you know how the story ends, so I'm not giving anything away, but their successful destruction of Dracula really does depend in so many ways on Mina, right, as we're going to see. And is that a progressive, right, a politically progressive part of the book in which a kind of feminism emerges towards, as the book, over the course of the book, which I think is a very interesting question. We have this issue that some of you maybe have come upon in other classes, this issue of the new woman, with the big N, big W, emerging towards the end of the 19th century in England. We have books that are interested in the odd women, the new women, the new woman, a new species of English womanhood seems to emerge towards the end of the century, and it's very controversial and it's exactly what you would imagine it would be. The new women want to have careers. I mean, look at what, now this one is sort of complex the way it's presented, but look at note what Mina has to say. The first time we hear from Mina, her first letter, she says, I have been practicing shorthand very assiduously. When we were married, I should be able to be useful to Jonathan. And if I can stenograph well enough, I can take down what he wants to say in this way and write it out for him on the typewriter, at which I am also practicing very hard. And that might to us sound old-fashioned, but it was not at that time. Typewriters were relatively new devices, okay? But the larger point is simply that she is, right, now, though she's here saying, well, when I'm married, I'll be able to help my husband. This is aside from that little notation, what she seems to be committing herself to here is a career, right? Which is not something that a lot of women at the time had. And there's a strong suggestion, of Mina here as someone who, if she broke up with her husband or ended up not getting married to him for this reason or that reason, maybe because he gets eaten alive by Dracula's sisters, she's not going to be left, economically in a bad situation. She's going to be able to earn her own living. So that's an issue as well. But let's move on. Darwinian? You've heard of Charles Darwin, the mid-Victorian author of The Origin of Species in 1859 and The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, 1871, among other works. These are the works in which what we now know of as evolution received its first systematic and scientific formulation and exposition. Though others had talked about a lot of these concepts, it took Darwin to put them together into a coherent and well-developed theory. The fundamental premise of Darwin's theory is so basic that we now think of it as the basic premise of Darwinism, which has become short for social Darwinism, as I shall soon explain, is as follows. And this is a quote from The Origin of Species itself. Quote, Chapter 4. If variations useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life. And from the strong principle of inheritance, they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. Now, it would be interesting to work through Darwinian theory here for a few minutes, but I want to keep this video brief, reasonably brief. And I think probably you've encountered this idea before. You have the basic notion of evolution is not foreign to you. This notion that you have mutation, you have what he calls variation, produced simply by nature, by mutation in nature, in individuals as they are born. They're born a little bit different from other individuals. Those who have qualities or characteristics that in fact enable them to survive better are more likely to have offspring, and therefore their particular characteristics will be passed on by way of their genes, which interestingly, Darwin didn't even have a developed theory of genetics, and he was still figuring all this out, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. But natural selection would be that process, right? Is the name for that process whereby individuals who are more fit, as we have come to call them, he didn't call them that, not right away. They last, right? They live, they make it. Maybe because they've got bigger claws. So they pass on that principle or that quality of bigger claws to their offspring. And so you have what's called selection for bigger claws going on in nature. Now, this may not seem all that alarming for all my talk of claws. And despite the phrase, Darwin's own phrase, the struggle for life, right, which is a little bit scary sounding. And indeed, we must generalize. I mean, here's a question, must we generalize from the sphere? It's a very fundamental question that was addressed by Darwin, encountered by Darwin himself. Must we generalize from the sphere of plants and animals and like amoeba and paramecia to humans, right? To the sphere of the human. As James Alan Rogers argues, Darwin himself thought that his theory of, quote, natural selection described a biological process and not a social philosophy, certainly. So if you're going to generalize to the human sphere, you certainly should not generalize to the social sphere, ideas, for example, like religious belief or something beyond like the biological qualities of like red hair versus green eyes, that humans might possess, right? Where perhaps you could see some form of natural selection operating. But as Rogers argues, 2 months after, how did Darwin feel about all this? 2 months after the publication of the first edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin wrote to his friend Charles Lyell, I have received in a Manchester newspaper rather a good squib showing that I have proved might is right, and therefore that Napoleon is right, and every cheating tradesman is also right. And he was laughing at this notion that what he had done in writing of the struggle for life is, for example, sanction people who felt that we needed to perhaps in being Christians, we needed to dominate other religions because, after all, our religion was a religion of the fittest, and therefore, the sooner the other religions died out in the struggle for life, the better. I mean, you can see how that would be an alarming idea to a lot of people, especially if you happen to be a member of the other religion. Many Victorians did not share Darwin's distinction. They did not distinguish between Darwin's attention to plants and their own attention to, for example, the class system, or what they regarded as the hierarchy of religions or races, color, skin color, qualities and characteristics that we associate with certain ethnic groups. I mean, this is where this gets very, very scary, right? For a lot of people. And this is also where we get to this thing called social Darwinism. And the social Darwinists came on the scene, and they were people who made a point of not distinguishing. Herbert Spencer is a great example of this. He's the guy who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, which Darwin himself did not use until much later. Then it just became so common that he himself started to use it, I think trying to rob it a little bit of this scariness that it may seem to possess on the face of it even. And, I mentioned here below, I'll let you read through that on your own, what Julian Huxley had to say about it. Look, the Victorians were capable of imagining, in fact, they were committed to a notion of progress, of social progress. I mean, you can imagine that this idea, if we're all getting kind of better by way of natural selection, maybe this wouldn't be so alarming. But again, if you happen to be one of those whose qualities make you such that you were selected out by this natural process, it's maybe not going to be all that reassuring to see analogies between your typical concept, this kind of accepted concept that we're making progress and leaving bad things behind. When you're one of those bad things, and you just because you happen to have red hair, then you can see how this would not be very reassuring, right? Many Victorians, like Stoker, read Spencer, and they adopted a very different view, very different from what Huxley was offering as a sunny way of looking at it all. And in short, social Darwinism triumphed in the popular mind. It became Darwinism for all intents and purposes. And its basic tenet was that we are in a war of all against all, and that morality and Christianity, for example, are at best social mechanisms with biological purposes. There's nothing in and of itself about Christianity that makes it worthy, only insofar as it helps us to survive, Christians to survive better than, for example, Muslims. Is it a religion that we should accept? You can imagine that this would be an extremely painful and scary kind of attitude to find yourself gravitating towards as a late Victorian. Religious belief itself becomes, in the words of a famous poet of the era, Alfred Lord Tennyson, religious belief, religious expressions of religious belief are but the noise of, quote, an infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light. Now, what does all this have to do with Renfield? Well, I'd argue a lot. I'm not going to explore that a lot here at length. and I think it could be explored. I think there's more to it than what I'm about to share with you, but suffice it for now to call your attention to the interesting, as Seward denominates them, the interesting RENFIELD's interest in animals and insects and whatnot, which Seward calls his pets. Now, this interest in animals and insects and whatnot begins with an interest in flies. It turns to an interest in spiders. This is all, of course, recorded by Seward in his letters, and then turns from the interest in spiders, which itself represented a turn from the interest in flies, to an interest in sparrows, right? And you will recall that his interest in flies is such that when he turns to spiders, there are not many flies left anymore. It makes you wonder why he got the flies to begin with. He's been feeding them to the spiders. And then, of course, when we get to the sparrows, it becomes clear, the spider population having diminished, that he has moved on to feed the spiders to the sparrows, and so on. And you will recall he asked Seward for a kitten, a nice, sleek, playful kitten that I can play with and teach and feed and feed and feed. When Seward refuses, as he does, RENFIELD is crestfallen, but not without, as Seward reports, quote, a sudden fierce sidelong look, which meant killing. The man is an undeveloped homicidal maniac, Seward judges. Seward finds blood and feathers on his pillow, having fed the sparrows fly-fed spiders. RENFIELD has himself been feeding on the sparrows. And one fears for any cat, however sparrow-fed, unfortunate enough to be given to him. And you'll recall that in an earlier moment, Seward came upon RENFIELD unexpectedly, and he sees RENFIELD actually swallow some spiders and flies, right? So this is the business with the sparrows is not just a mistake being made by Seward, because he's already seen this, as he calls it, what he ends up calling him, a zoophagous, life-eating maniac, right? What he desires, Seward goes on, is to absorb as many lives as he can and to achieve it in a cumulative way. I would argue that we may call him a Darwinian. Now, how so? Well, because if you pay close attention to what's been happening, what I've just been talking about, what's been happening before Seward himself becomes fascinated by. This is an educated, if unbalanced, man, this RENFIELD, we're told that when we first meet him, who deliberately seeks, deliberately, if weirdly, obliquely, and ferociously, to recapitulate the process whereby the human, according to Darwin, arose out of previous lower life forms. Perhaps this is all intuitively obvious to you, but let me explain. The spider, I guess you could say, becomes the bird when the bird eats a spider. His spiderness is left behind as he is transformed into birdness, and this process continues at every step. It may be seen as continuing even up to the level of the human who eats whatever eats the cat that the human then eats, or whatever eats that which eats the cat that the human then eats. This is, I think you would agree, a nightmare version of natural selection, one in which the survival of the fittest is witnessed by born witness to by one who sees the fitter eating the slightly less fit, the fittest of all eating the second most fit, and so on. It is a world in which all are against all, the winner take all, the winner being he or she who eats all, right? Okay. So what I would argue is that what we have on display in the book, in this very strange episode of RENFIELD, RENFIELD is a very fascinating character, I think you would agree. And in fact, I believe a movie has been made that is entitled RENFIELD. And it's devoted, I guess, to the story of RENFIELD as opposed to the story of Dracula. It's the backstory that got RENFIELD where we meet him when this novel begins. But I think what is put on display by way of RENFIELD in the original book here, if not in the movie that has followed, and I think in probably some fan fiction that has followed as well, is a profound Victorian fear and fascination that is on display. Here is the fear. Are we just humans, or are we rather humans? Are we humans just self-deluded killing machines, consumers in a literal sense, ruled by our stomachs, our appetites, which are themselves ruled by some inhuman principle of nature, red in tooth and claw. Is that what we are? This is a different view of human nature, I think you would agree, from what most of us are comfortable with. And I think it's certainly different these days, what we're comfortable with. And I think it's certainly different from the view of human nature that most Victorians were comfortable with. Okay? I mean, if you think you have a problem with it, I want you to imagine what a Victorian moralist, right, might have to feel, might have to say about it, you know. Note finally, by the way, before we end, and we're about to end because this was supposed to be a brief micro lecture. It's not one of the longer ones, but I don't know that you would call it brief. Note finally Seward's disturbing meditation on Redfield. Okay, Seward thinks of allowing Seward to continue and thereby to complete, as he puts it, the experiment. Now he sounds in these moments, doesn't he, a little bit like, you know, some of these scientists that we've run into before the semester, the Muniers, right, the Victors especially, and even Jekyll, in Jekyll's vainer moments, okay, where he seems more caught up in the scientific experiment for its own sake, as opposed to this moral kind of enterprise that is at the heart of it for him. I think he has moments where he sounds a little bit more like, I mean, none of them, with the possible exception of Munier, seems to be just committed to science itself purely. There's always some sort of ulterior motive. But Seward in this moment, okay, he also has the ulterior motive, but at least on the surface, it looks like it's science, right? And I think we already know that's dangerous. What is that ulterior motive? Well, he seems infected, doesn't he? At some level, I don't think it's at the deepest levels, thankfully, with Redfield's Darwinian spirit, which in his case takes on a kind of professional incarnation, right? Wishing for a sufficient cause, as he puts it, which is really an excuse, to allow Redfield to continue and to, I guess, go and procure a cat and give it to him, and then just allow Redfield to run the show. You know, after the cat, what next? Seward, is tempted, this is his own language, by the promise of professional elevation to be won thereby. Thinks he's going to write up an article about Redfield after the fact and rise in position, right? And maybe become like a really important professor as a consequence of having studied Redfield's brain, as he puts it, right? And you can see at the bottom of all this, which thankfully is not the bottom of Seward entirely. I think he has deeper motives, which move him beyond this purely Darwinian kind of ambition, here taking on a sophisticated form as that of scientific ambition, right? We see him, you know, in this little fantasy of professional elevation. We see him imagine himself as more advanced and imagine himself as, in fact, becoming more professionally advanced because he already is more advanced. He's just, in a sense, here we get the nature thing, right? It has nothing to do with merit. It doesn't have to do with the fact that he's a better scientist than other people because he's worked harder, you know, and he's, you know, kind of put more effort into it or anything like that. It's rather because he just happens to possess, because he was given by nature, see, it's survival of the fittest. He's fitter. He puts it this way: a good cause may turn the scale for me. For may I too not be of an exceptional brain congenitally? Maybe I was born with an exceptional brain, and this is one of the ways to allow that exceptional brain exercise and allow it to prove just how exceptional my nature is. So it's a kind of Darwinian moment of vanity, right? Where he thinks that he might be one of the fitter intellectually, okay, if not just by way of his ability to eat the thing below him. I guess you could call it almost a kind of intellectual, an appetite for an intellectual form of consumption, whereby he would consume these meager and minor brains around him as he achieved his own prominence at the top of the food chain intellectually. Well, anyway, you can see once again how all this might work as an expression of a deep-seated fear amongst the Victorians of a all surrendering to the natural, surrendering to the animal, to the appetitive, okay, and just becoming like consumers, as I said before, in a kind of literal sense, walking around with no higher motive, and certainly no moral or religious motive. Well, that's enough for today, and I will see you all again soon. Bye-bye.